To kick us off, please welcome Congressman Joaquin Castro, his twin brother, Julián Castro, the former mayor, current HUD secretary, and the architect of Pre-K for SA. Unfortunately, he couldn't be here in person as he'd hoped, but he is joining us by phone. And my colleague, Atlantic senior editor Ron Brownstein, is here to lead the conversation. Take it away, Ron.
That comes through the sound system, not from the podium. It's called the voice of God. And this morning, in the role of the voice of God, we have your former mayor, Julián Castro, who I think is with us here. Can you hear me, Mayor?
I can. It's great to be with y'all.
Welcome.
Thanks for letting me be a part of this, and let me just start by apologizing to all of the good folks in my hometown that I'm not able to be there in person. I definitely, with the weather and missing home, I would definitely prefer to be there.
Well, thank you for joining us. Let me start by asking you, often when we do events about education and opportunity, I will ask panelists kind of the hypothetical question. If you had $1 to spend and your goal was to reduce some of the opportunity gaps that we now see in society, where would you choose to spend it? You actually went through this process not as a theoretical exercise, but as an actual exercise in San Antonio, because your pre-K program grew out of not a process of deciding where to start an early childhood program, but from exactly that kind of calculation. Where could you make the biggest difference? Where could you have the largest point of leverage by investing your dollars? Talk a little bit about that process and why you settled on pre-K as the answer.
Yeah, you're right. We didn't start off by saying, absolutely, we're going to invest the last 1/8 of a cent sales tax that we had available at that time in early childhood education. Pre-K for SA really started out of an effort called the Brainpower Task Force that was a combination of business leaders and education leaders who were charged with looking at if we were to take that last 1/8 of a cent sales tax capacity that San Antonio had left, how could we best use it to move the needle on education? And at the beginning of the process, we looked at everything from whether there was a way that we could invest to prevent folks from dropping out or get dropouts back into the school system, to what we could do during those middle school years that are often this tenuous task for young people where they can go in the right direction or the wrong direction. But ultimately, after going through the research, inviting experts in to make their presentations, what we found was, and what other cities have found, is that the evidence is very compelling that if you have that dollar to spend, it's best spent on children when they're young, when their minds are developing at their fastest, when you can make the biggest difference in setting them on a strong trajectory educationally. And so that's how we came to understand that we should put that resource into early childhood education.
Now, as I understand it, when you, at the time you passed the effort, most kids in the city were enrolled in some kind of pre-K. Some districts had part day, some districts had full day. What were you specifically hoping to add with this program to what already existed at the time you implemented it?
Two things. First of all, we identified a gap of 5,700 young people every year who would be eligible for pre-K but were not getting full-day pre-K. You're right. There are 15 independent school districts that operate within the bounds of San Antonio, and some of them have full day, some of them only have half day, and so we wanted to provide full-day pre-K, and secondly, we wanted to make it the best quality in the state of Texas. And so it was really these two things, filling that gap and making sure that the quality of it was better than anything else out there. And that's what drove us to put together the Pre-K for SA proposal.
And Julián, I guess Julián, this is Joaquin. You remember that there was some debate after SA 2020 and this plan to do something about education in San Antonio. Even when you guys got together, there was a debate about whether to spend it on pre-K or higher ed. In fact, I advocated for spending some of that money on higher ed. My brother didn't listen to me, obviously, wisely. But it wasn't clear that was the only thing or the main thing that we were going to do. I think it turns out to have been a great decision. But there was a lot of debate about how to use that money.
I know you've been obviously working on other things the last couple of years, but I'm wondering what your thoughts are. You've now been up and running since 2013 here. What do you think are the major lessons that you've learned, most important things you've learned in these first years of operation?
It's a great question, and of course, Kathy and Brock and Elaine Mendoza and others can probably speak more granularly to the schools and within the classroom. But I would just say, the big picture, number one, that it took a lot of working with the existing system, because Pre-K for SA is really built on what public schools in San Antonio are already offering. It's taking that half day and then putting on another half day on top of it. So these are students that technically are still on the rolls of whatever school district they would have come from. One of the biggest lessons I learned was just how important it was to go and do the outreach to these school districts and get those school districts on board. The second thing that stuck in my mind as it ramped up was the importance of the outreach to parents, because we had a whole bunch of parents who were eligible, or their children were eligible, this opportunity was in front of them, but it wasn't like, we had all of the seats filled up right away. In fact, in that first year, we actually didn't quite hit the mark in terms of enrollment. We were almost there, and it was a Herculean effort to get there, and overall it was great, but technically we didn't get there. We did after that, but that was a reminder that all of the outreach work to the community in getting parents to be aware of the program was so important. After that first year, I think more and more of that took care of itself, because parents had a great experience with their kids in the program, and the word of mouth spread in those neighborhoods. And now what you see is that they're over capacity, they're oversubscribed. So I'd say that outreach worked, and the program has a great reputation, and that's helping it drive attendance.
Congressman, I'm going to ask you your thoughts on the lessons in a minute, but I want to ask your brother two more questions before we lose him. And this is a question from sort of your national perch. I mean, we have seen a number of cities now in the last few years go down this road of trying to expand access to pre-K on their own. Denver, Seattle, New York City, Chicago. How far do you think cities can advance this cause by themselves, and how much do they need intervention and support from larger entities, either states or the federal government?
Yeah, cities can do a lot, and San Antonio is a good example. New York is a fantastic example more recently of that. Cities can do a lot. However, at the end of the day, this is fundamentally still a responsibility and a challenge that's going to have to be met by the state government, because that's where the lion's share of funding is coming from. So we were very fortunate that we had that 1/8 of a cent sales tax left. Most big cities in Texas don't have that available anymore. So the revenue stream is not there under Texas law. In other parts of the country, they found creative ways to fund pre-K, but the number of students in those seats compared to the overall number of children being funded by the state is still relatively small. And so in Pre-K for SA, there's a lesson in that, because we built it on the system that was already in place by the state, by adding on to that half day that the state is already funding. I think that's an important model for other communities to look at, cities to look at, if they're considering investing in early childhood education. Take advantage of the resources that are already being invested, and then improve the quality from there with your own efforts.
Can I ask you two? I want to ask you two more questions of kind of a national perspective, and then we will let you get back to your day. One thing that is a fact of life for Hispanic and African American kids in almost every major city. In a study we just published last week in Next America, the Next America Project, which is sponsoring this event, we found that in 85 of the 100 largest cities in America, a majority of African American and a majority of Hispanic kids attend schools where most of their classmates qualify as poor or low income. In fact, 78% of Latino kids and 73% of African American kids in San Antonio, for example, attend majority low income schools. The numbers are even worse in several of the other Texas cities. Is it possible, do you think, to equalize educational opportunity without tackling that level of economic and often racial segregation in the schools?
Oh, you absolutely have to. Number one, states have to make the investment that they ought to be making, starting with even the 0 to 3 age range, and then in pre-K and beyond that. And so, number one, there has to be a more robust and smarter investment in getting folks into an early and good start in their educational journey. But you also have to look at neighborhoods and where these kids are and how you can holistically lift up the quality of life and economic opportunity in those neighborhoods for their parents, too. That's why one of the things I'm most proud of the Obama administration, and San Antonio is a good example with a promise zone and a promise neighborhood and choice neighborhood effort there, is this effort to break through the silo. So connect education to housing, to transportation, to the environment that folks live in. If we can do that on a local basis and a state basis, I think that we can start more effectively addressing economic segregation and racial segregation and lift up the prospects for a lot of these kids.
And housing? What about housing? And housing
Absolutely.
segregation?
Yeah, and the choice neighborhood effort and promise zones include and are driven by that effort to improve the housing stock in an area and to ensure that we have great housing opportunity throughout the city.
Let me ask you one final question, and then we'll let you go and ask your brother to weigh in on the congressman on the same question. You know, as I said, the Next America Project, which is a sponsor of this event today, we try to look at how changing demography is changing the national agenda. And in that respect, in many ways, Texas is America on fast forward. We've just crossed the threshold nationally where a majority of the public school students nationwide are kids of color. In Texas, it's over 70%. We expect, the demographers expect a majority of the under 18 population nationwide to be kids of color sometime later this decade. In Texas, again, it's already about 2/3. The projections from Steve Murdoch, the former head of the Census Bureau under President Bush, now at Rice University, is that all of the net growth in the Texas workforce over the next 3.5 decades will be diverse workers. Latinos alone will provide 3/4 of the total net new workers in the state. When you look at the way the state is responding to these changes, both in the public sector leadership and the private sector leadership, how would you assess the degree of awareness, magnitude, and urgency of the response to this level of demographic change that the state will be experiencing in the years to come?
Yeah, it's safe to say that it varies. And Steve Murdoch has just done a fantastic job of laying out the case, that the writing is on the wall, that we have a choice. Either we can make the right investments and ensure that you have a generation of young people that are well educated and have the skills to compete in this 21st century global economy, and you can prosper if you do that, or you might be able to do well in the short term, but if you don't equip that generation with those skills and that knowledge, they're not going to be able to compete, and the state is not going to be able to compete in the 21st century global economy. And so Texas, I think in the short term, is doing a lot of things that folks think, well, they're getting jobs into the state using incentives and tax incentives and abatements and so forth, getting some quick hits. But my concern is that the state is not laying a stronger long-term foundation to be competitive in the 21st century global economy where, as I said a million times when I was mayor, where brain power is the currency of success. That's why a program like Pre-K for SA and what other communities are doing in other cities is so important to raise that crop of young people who are prepared and can compete, are going to drive your economy forward.
All right, Mr. Castro, thank you very much for joining us. We'll let you go now, but luckily we have another Castro right here. So let me.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for being with us. Same question for you. The demographic transition in Texas is not really, it's like debating the weather. I mean, it is. It just is it is a fact. It is more accelerated, more profound here than even in most places, although it's certainly happening to a lesser extent around the country. 300 of the 500 largest school districts in America are now majority kids of color. Right. When you look at the way the state is responding, what would you add to what your brother said?
I think it leaves a lot to be desired. I think if you look at Texas over the last several years, there was a lot of talk about the Texas miracle, for example. And it's true that Texas, compared to a lot of other states, or actually any other state, for many years created more jobs than any state in the nation, which is something I think all Texans are proud of. But if you look at what was going on, and to extent what's still going on, is we were creating jobs, but we were also importing from other states millions and millions of people, oftentimes the folks who are taking those jobs. So what we had is a situation where we're not training Texans with a strong education system and a strong higher ed system to actually qualify for a lot of the jobs that we're bringing in. So there's a little bit of a disjuncture there, a bit of a shell game, quite honestly. And I think that our politicians and our leaders need to get in the middle of that and build a stronger educational foundation so that it's Texans that are creating and getting the new jobs.
So let's talk a little bit. You've looked at the question of access to pre-K from a national level.
Right.
And one of the statistics from the National Center for Educational Statistics is that about 2/3 of 4-year-olds, about 40% of 3-year-olds are in some kind of pre-K program. But they report those numbers have actually not increased since 2000. Why are we stuck, and what is the answer?
Well, I think one of the big reasons we're stuck is because because of the way pre-K dollars are distributed. A lot of that money goes, in fact, most of that money comes from the federal government and goes to the states. So you're dependent upon a governor or state legislature to say, we're going to accept that money with the strings attached, right? Whether they like them or not. We're going to accept that money and we're going to dole it out to the school districts. So part of the legislation that I filed, pre-K for USA rather than pre-K for SA, is to essentially allow cities and counties and school districts to circumvent the state and draw on money directly from the federal government. It's not just a problem in education. In Texas, for example, a few years back, Governor Perry rejected a bunch of unemployment money when we were still going through the recession. There's not been an expansion of Medicaid. So everybody in these local areas is subject to what the governor decides to do, and I think we ought to change that.
But that's an interesting point, because I mean, going back to the 90s, the Bill Clinton administration, Democrats, and even really going back to Medicaid in the 60s, Democrats have often preferred this model of providing federal dollars and allowing states to join in as a way of expanding a program they think is a social good.
Right.
The S-CHIP program in the 90s, the Medicaid program in the 60s. Certainly that is the model that President Obama has proposed on expanding access to pre-K, and Hillary Clinton, who you support, has proposed on expanding access to pre-K. In the post-Medicaid world, where the significant majority of Republican-led states chose not to expand under the ACA, do you think that model is now obsolete?
I think if not obsolete, I just think there's a better one. There is a more local model that we should pursue, because you're right. You get into states like Texas where there's a huge need with healthcare, and a governor who says, I'm just not going to expand it, well, nobody gets that money. So there are people who literally are ailing with diseases like cancer and others who are not going to get coverage because the governor has decided he's not going to take that money. The same thing with education.
Why even though depend on the mayor? I mean, if your view is that children anywhere, I assume, would benefit from access to pre-K.
Right.
So why not make, if the federal government is going to do this, why not make it something like Title I? Where in essence, there's no intermediary.
Yeah, no, and I think school districts, for example, should be able to bid to the federal government.
Okay.
And if you look at other parts of federal resources, like HUD with my brother, a lot of that money doesn't go through the state, it goes through local housing authorities.
Yeah, right.
So that footprint, that model is already in place in other departments.
What's the case? Have you been convinced that there is, in fact, an airtight case that expanded access to pre-K ultimately produces better educational and life outcomes?
Oh, sure. I mean, if the question is, does going through pre-K better prepare a student than not going through it? I don't think there's any debate about that.
Because there are still, the study out of Tennessee, for example, that question whether the gains can be sustained if,
Sure.
As you go into the education system.
Oh, no, and I think that speaks to the fact that you've got to have a strong education system, pre-K through college, basically, right? But the studies have shown that it gives students a strong start. Mm-hmm. That has to be sustained as they go on.
This project here has built in a lot of evaluation right from the beginning.
Right.
So talk a little bit about, in your mind, what will be the determination in your mind of whether this is in fact a success?
I think ultimately, well, let me first say that this is one piece, right? I mean, there's an education pipeline. Each of those pieces, all of that infrastructure has to be successful. I spent a lot of time in the Texas legislature and even now in Congress on higher education issues and getting more students who graduate from high school to go on to college and complete. So ultimately, the goal is for San Antonio to bring up a generation of students who graduate from college or go into the workforce and are successful. But we figured out that we couldn't make that happen, or it was going to be a lot harder to make that happen unless we did something about the pre-K piece. And I'm glad that we did.
Now, one of the things in writing about these issues over the years, the question, and it was kind of alluded to it a little bit earlier when we were talking about the concentrations of poverty in the school. How much can you lean on the education system to overcome a whole series of factors? Is it realistic to expect schools themselves, even starting earlier with pre-K, to reverse all of the other challenges facing low-income communities?
The schools aren't a panacea for all of the social challenges that we face. You have a lot of kids who come from households of deep poverty, for example, where I grew up in the West Side. I often use the example in higher ed of students applying to college. We have a system there where a lot of students don't have parents that went to college themselves, so they get hardly any college advising. And then we've created a system in schools, an anachronistic counseling system, college advising system, so they don't really get it there. But I do think that the schools doing everything that they can to supplement or to improve upon what's going on at home, I think can be very helpful. And then you have nonprofits like Avance, who are trying to do the work of parenting and improving parenting skills.
And that's one of the interesting things about the San Antonio initiative is that there's a big parent component.
Right.
A big
it
outreach.
engages the parent. And
Talk
you
a
see
little bit
that,
about that. Yeah.
Well, I think that we found that, and this is not new, but that the more you engage parents, the more successful those kids are likely to be, especially in the early years. And what I found over the years, just in my role as basically a legislator in San Antonio, is that I would go visit schools. I'd go to elementary schools, middle schools, high schools, all of them. And if you went to a PTA meeting at an elementary school, you'd see a lot of parents. And then the middle school would have less parents. And by high school, there's about 3 people who are holding up the banner, right? Because folks have spread out. Now, admittedly, in high school, there's other things going on, the band club and the athletic clubs and all that parents can support. But you do see a lot more participation early on. We want to make sure that sticks around as we get into the later grades.
Now, turn back to your legislation for a couple questions. This debate has been stuck from day one. The president proposed it. As I said, Secretary Clinton proposed it in her campaign, but there's been very little interest among Republicans in Congress, even though a number of red states like Oklahoma and Georgia have undertaken their own initiatives to expand access to pre-K. You've been there a while. Is there any way to kind of reconfigure this debate and kind of reshape it that it will allow this discussion to get out of the frozen state that it's in now?
Well, when the Congress passed ESSA in December, there is money for pre-K there, which is good. The bill itself gave generally more flexibility to the states. That was one of the conditions of a Republican majority Congress to pass that major overhaul. But I think that what we have to do is depoliticize it as much as possible. It shouldn't be seen as a Republican or a Democratic issue. To the extent that we can do that, or even a small government or big government issue, if you get caught in those different political axes, it's going to be tough sometimes to implement a program in a red state, for example.
So here's one thing I've wondered about a way of potentially changing the dynamic. When SCHIP was created in '97, a program to expand access to health care.
And Texas was one of the last states to take that up, too.
But when SCHIP was created, it was created as part of a budget package that reduced projected spending on Medicare. It was, in effect, part of a generational rebalancing of the budget. It wasn't really raising the 97 budget deal did not raise new taxes, but it expanded a program for young people by saying, well, federal government now spends $7 per capita on seniors for every dollar it spends on kids, which is the number, roughly. So one thing I've wondered is whether there might be more, whether it would change the parameters or the polarity of the debate at all if Democrats are willing to say that maybe the way to fund an expanded investment in the next generation, who ultimately are going to support Medicare and Social Security through their productivity, would be to constrain some of the spending on entitlement programs, as opposed to raising new taxes to fund for it.
I hope AARP's not here.
No, I'm right. But is that like completely, like, is that, because you are kind of right at a brick wall here, with Republicans really not even contemplating this idea, and the prospects of them not controlling the House in the near future are probably pretty small. So Is there any way to rethink about how to frame this debate in a way that might broaden the audience for expanded pre-K?
No, I mean, there certainly is. And I think all things should be on the table and at least looked at, right? But we've got to be committed to this work because this is what creates a strong foundation later on for all of these kids that are growing up, especially as our country is becoming more diverse.
Yeah.
And so we've got to find a way to
You know,
make
that
it
is one
work.
of the most striking things about the current access to pre-K. Again, using the National Center for Educational Statistics data. If you look at it, 75% of kids from parents with a postgraduate degree are in pre-K. 70% of those from parents with a four-year degree are in pre-K. Only 59% of those with a high school degree or less are in pre-K. So to some extent, you know, as you see in the education system, which is supposed to be our escalator of upward mobility, kind of sanding down class differences, in many ways it functions to reinforce them.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's true. We saw this in San Antonio where a lot of the areas that are served by pre-K for SA, a lot of those parents, their kids were not going to pre-K programs. And so there is this incredible need. And, you know, I see Patty Riddle here from the San Antonio Independent School District Board, who represents the West Side where I grew up, and she knows the incredible need in that area. Cheryl Scully, the city manager, is here who helped with my brother shepherd that pre-K for SA program. And so, you know, you asked about lessons to my brother, and I think one of the lessons for me is that the pre-K for SA program represents a city in one area saying that we are not going to wait for Washington and Austin to act. Now, it turns out after that, in the last legislative session, Austin did commit more money for pre-K education. And I think they owe us a thank you because San Antonio spearheaded that initiative. I mean, that really was our work. Getting it done, putting it into the state conversation, and I think on some level the national conversation. I know Oklahoma and New York and others have also done it, but making this not just about one city, but really a movement to change education.
Yeah. Well, let's. I want to save a couple questions for the end, but let's
Sure.
bring in the audience for a few minutes for questions. Are there there's a microphone, I think, around? Yes, there's a microphone. So if you have questions, please. We have one right up here. Lindsay is heading your way.
Sure. Hi, my name is Allison Brim. I work with the Texas Organizing Project, and I was hoping you would talk a little bit about, coming back to the San Antonio pre-K for SA, what you think the keys are to making sure that it continues to have success and build on itself, perhaps expand to 3-year-olds. I know it'll be going back to the voters in 2020, maybe.
Right.
So what do we need to be doing now to make sure that that success continues here locally?
Well, all indications are that the pre-K centers are a success so far, so that's great news. Every time I've come across a parent, sometimes I'll be at HEB or somewhere else, and somebody will come up to me and say, oh, my daughter or my son is in pre-K for SA. They come up to me because they think I'm my brother, and so they want to say thank you. I always correct them, but you know, they're very pleased with the program. In fact, a few weeks ago, somebody said that they moved their child from a private school into the pre-K for SA program. So I think the quality of instruction and the operation has to remain great. Hopefully the city, and I believe it will remain committed to the pre-K for SA program. And then finally, remember, this only came about with the partnership of the school districts. The school districts have to remain committed to the program, and I believe that they will also. And I think another thank you from us to the business community is that folks forget, we were able to transcend ideological and political lines here. You had Joe Robles from USAA, of course, the huge insurance and real estate and financial company, and also Charles Butt, who owns HEB, grocery stores, as the two gentlemen who came together with a full committee to come up with this plan.
And what you mentioned, the business community was invested in the development and the passage of the plan. What's been their engagement since it's gone into effect?
It's been great. Folks are on the board, you know, making sure that it still succeeds. And as long as they continue to do that and everybody plays their role, I think it will be around for decades to come.
Yeah. Let's see. Other questions? There's one in the back.
My name is Adam Gates. I work for RVK Architects here in San Antonio. And my question's about curriculum. I guess for me, I'm seeing this difference between early childhood education in the form of pre-K and just daycare.
Right.
So, you know, what we're talking about has some sort of intent. It has some sort of a curriculum involved, like I said. So what are the goals in teaching young children at this age, and what does that curriculum want to look like? What are we trying to create in people at that young age?
You're right. You know, you get into this concern about, well, let me just put it this way. When this was on the ballot, and remember, it was on the ballot in November of 2012, and we specifically put it on the ballot in November of 2012 because we knew that was our best chance of passing it. Ordinarily, a lot of the city initiatives had been put on the May ballot, where you have a smaller electorate that tends to be more conservative in their outlook. So we knew if we put it up in May, it wasn't going to pass. So it passed with 53% in November. But one of the knocks against it during the debate was that this was going to be glorified daycare, that parents were going to support it just because they wanted to dump their kids off somewhere. Well, if you look at the curriculum and the operation, it's clear that that's just not true. This is about doing everything that we can to get these young kids and students to learn, to be prepared to go into kindergarten and first grade, elementary, and so forth. And so we're very proud of that, that it's actually engaging students and setting them up for the subject matters that they're going to deal with later on. And of course, you know, at that age, you have a lot of folks who are, you know, the kids that are working on interpersonal skills, relating to others. You know, I think about my own daughter who's almost 2.5, and for a long time she was an only child. So whenever she'd get around other kids, she would freak out. Right? There's a socialization element to it also that they're working on.
Other questions? Over here.
Good morning. I'm Gabrielle Lamonnier. I'm the treasurer for the Texas Alliance of Black School Educators. And earlier it was mentioned that many times minority students face schools that are filled with students of poverty. We also know that what comes with that is not always the most highly qualified teachers. So what did you all do to combat that, to ensure that in those schools you were able to ensure that the students were receiving instruction from teachers who were best prepared?
Well, that's a great question. You know, my dad was a teacher for 31 years, 26 of them in the Edgewood School District. I started school in Edgewood. And I had a lot of great teachers who inspired me. Unfortunately, I also had some that weren't so great over the years. But what we asked of the folks at Pre-K for SA is to go and recruit the very best folks they could find, and to make sure that the salary was also commensurate and competitive so that we could recruit the very best. And I've been somebody in the state who's advocated for paying our teachers better, for treating it like the job, treating it like the place it holds in our society and the importance it holds in our society. Well, we gave Pre-K for SA the leverage to do that.
Can I ask a follow-up question, actually from the question before I go to the next audience question? The sales tax increase that you put in, was that the most you could do legally?
It was.
Okay.
We had remaining a 1/8 cent sales tax left. A few years back, there was a proposal to use that 1/8 cent for a crime control district that failed, I think around 2006, 2007. Now, part of the reason that other cities have not taken this up is that they've already maxed out their sales tax. So they would have to figure out another way to go and finance.
I was going to say, so even if you decide this is a success, and you have clear evidence that it's working, would you have the capacity to expand it either to more eligible 4-year-olds or to 3-year-olds when it comes up in 2020? Would you have any funding mechanism by which you could do that, or are you basically capped out at what you're doing now?
Well, I know Cheryl could probably answer this better, but I suspect the city would have to commit money from another source, general revenue, for example. It could theoretically do that, but this is a dedicated revenue source.
And you're at the max.
And we're at the max.
You're on the max on the dedicated revenue source. And so ultimately, in all likelihood, I think you're saying, if you are going to expand it either to a broader pool of 4-year-olds, much less to 3-year-olds, you're probably going to need someone, the state, federal government to...
Yeah. No, and that was our intention. Our intention was obviously to supplement the educational experience in San Antonio, but quite honestly, we wanted to make this a movement. We wanted to start a larger conversation in Texas and throughout the nation on the importance of pre-kindergarten education. And I think to a large extent, we've been successful in that.
Have you talked to mayors, or your brother been consulted by mayors from the other cities that are now?
I know
moving
my
down
brother
this track?
has. Yeah, in Congress, I, along with Congresswoman Clark of Massachusetts, and 2 Republicans, have founded the Pre-K Caucus, which we're going to be kicking off soon. That will have membership of Republican and Democrat to support pre-kindergarten education as we go forward in Congress.
Maybe they'll be more successful at counting the ballots than the Iowa caucus, but
yeah.
let's see, over here. Sorry, I make you run right there. I think this will be our last question.
Hi, I'm June Halisack from Family Educators Alliance of South Texas. My question is, where do you stand when you have peer-reviewed studies that show that children that have been through pre-K programs at the beginning of their elementary education are above their peers, but by the time they get to 3rd or 4th grade, they are equal with their peers academically?
I mean, I think that we need to be paying attention to what's going on in kindergarten, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grade. I don't think that's an argument not to do everything that you can in those early years. That's an argument for improvement of the early years of elementary school.
Final question. We have a little time left. Let me ask you, if Democrat is elected president in 2016, you are supporting one of them, I believe. What would you counsel, and clearly this is a priority for Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, both have ambitious programs. What would you counsel them as a way to break the logjam that we have seen and to move this forward as a national priority?
To localize it, to move away from just running the money through the states, to follow the model at HUD and other departments where school districts or cities or counties, a more local governmental entity can bid for this money, so that we don't get caught up, as we have with Medicaid expansion, where you have Bexar County that wants to accept the money, or Travis or other counties, and they can't because the governor refuses to. And I think it works the reverse way. If you have a Republican president, there's going to be monies that they want to put forth that more conservative counties or cities are going to want to accept, but I think it works for them also.
Congressman, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Ron.
Margaret? I think we'll go this way.